They gave her 3 seconds to speak before the entire court, and she used every one of them saying nothing at all. The ballroom of Ashvane Palace had never been this quiet. 600 nobles, glasses of wine frozen halfway to their lips, watched Prince Kaelan Ashvane rip the engagement ring off Lady Elira Duvant's finger in front of his new bride-to-be, a merchant's daughter with a fortune 3 times the size of Elira's dying house. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't take her aside. He wanted every lord, every lady, every servant refilling those glasses to remember this moment, the great Prince Kaelan discarding damaged goods. "You were never anything but a debt I inherited," he said, and the court laughed carefully, the way people laugh when they're relieved it isn't happening to them. Elira did not cry, she did not beg. She smiled small, private, almost grateful, and that smile would haunt Kaelan for the rest of his life. Because nobody, not even he, understood yet what it meant. Nobody knew that 3 nights earlier, in the ruins beneath her family's crumbling estate, something ancient had opened one eye and looked directly at her. 5 years later, the Empire would learn her name the way you learn the name of a coming storm, too late to do anything but brace. 3 days before the humiliation, Elira Duvant already knew it was coming. She'd known for months if she was honest with herself. Known from the way Kaelan's letters had grown shorter, from the way his mother, Duchess Renata, looked at her during dinners like she was tallying the cost of a mistake. The Duvant family had once held the second richest silver mines in the Empire. Now the mines were flooded, the family coffers were empty, and the only thing Elira had left to offer the crown prince was a betrothal contract signed when she was 11 years old and had no say in the matter. She sat in the east garden that evening, tracing the edge of a cracked stone fountain when her old nurse Mabel found her. "They're saying he's already chosen the toast for the new engagement," Mabel whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though the hedges themselves might report her. "Milady, you should hear it from me before you hear it from the court crier." Elira didn't look up. "I already know, Mabel." "Then why aren't you?" Mabel stopped herself, studying the strange calm on her mistress's face. It wasn't the calm of acceptance. It was the calm of someone waiting for a door to open. That door had opened 2 nights before, in the sealed cellar beneath the old east wing, a cellar Elira had been forbidden to enter since childhood. Ever since her grandmother, the last true sorceress of House Duvant, had died screaming about something waking up down there. Elira had gone anyway, candle in hand, driven by nothing more than restless grief and a stubborn refusal to sit still, while her life was decided by men who'd never asked her opinion on anything. What she found down there wasn't treasure. It was a circle of black stone, veins of dull gold running through it like dried blood, and at its center, a single word carved in a language that hadn't been spoken aloud in 400 years. Ashkarian. The moment she read it, not spoke it, only read it, the candle in her hand died and the darkness around her breathed. "You took your time," said a voice that was not a voice, more like a pressure behind her eyes. "I have been waiting for a Duvant with nothing left to lose." Elira should have run, instead she knelt. "I have nothing to lose," she said quietly, "because they've already taken everything worth keeping." "Then let us discuss," the presence said, amused, ancient, hungry in a way she didn't yet understand, "what you might take back." She didn't sign anything. There was no contract, no blood oath sealed in candlelight the way the old stories always claimed. There was only an exchange of understanding, an old and broken power recognizing a girl who had also been broken, and deciding that perhaps two broken things, put together, might finally be sharp enough to cut. When Elira climbed the cellar stairs before dawn, nothing about her looked different. Her hands were the same, her face was the same tired, pale oval it had always been. But when she passed her own reflection in the hallway mirror for 1/2 second, her eyes flashed gold instead of brown, and something in the mirror's glass cracked in a hairline pattern shaped almost like a smile. She told no one, not Mabel. Not her ailing father, who slept most days now, worn down by debts he refused to explain to his daughter. She simply returned to her room, folded her hands, and waited for the humiliation she now knew was coming, because she understood with sudden and total clarity that being cast out was not the end of her story. It was the door slamming shut on a house that no longer deserved her. The morning of the engagement ball, Duchess Renata visited Elira's chambers personally, a rare, almost mocking courtesy. "Wear something humble tonight," the Duchess said, examining her own gloved nails rather than Elira's face. "It would be undignified to compete with the bride-to-be." "I wouldn't dream of it, Your Grace," Elira said. The Duchess's eyes narrowed slightly at the tone, too calm, too composed for a girl about to lose everything, but she said nothing more. She had bigger schemes to attend to that evening. Elira dressed in gray. Not out of humility, but because gray was the color of ash, and ash she had learned only 2 nights ago was simply what remained after something had finished burning, and what remained after fire was often the only thing strong enough to build on. As she descended the staircase toward the ballroom doors, the golden light of 100 chandeliers spilling over her, she caught her reflection once more in the tall hallway mirrors. Her eyes did not flash gold this time. But something in them had already changed, something patient, something waiting, something that smiled at the exact moment the ballroom doors swung open and 600 faces turned to watch the beginning of what they all assumed would be her end. None of them understood yet that they were about to make the single greatest mistake of their lives, and that some mistakes take exactly 5 years to finish collecting their price. The ballroom smelled of orange blossom and old money, and Elira walked through it the way a ghost walks through a house it no longer owns. Prince Kaelan stood at the center of the room in his ceremonial. One arm already curled possessively around Sabine Cormont, the merchant heiress whose father had recently discovered a new trade route through the southern strait, and whose dowry could apparently purchase what 5 generations of Duvant loyalty could not. Sabine wore red, not out of ignorance, out of intention. Everyone in that room understood exactly what red meant on a night that was supposed to be Elira's engagement anniversary celebration. Duchess Renata had timed it perfectly, announced the new match on the exact date the old one was meant to be celebrated, so the humiliation would need no explanation. The court would simply see in a single glance what had been chosen and what had been discarded. Elira stopped 10 feet from the prince. The music did not stop. That was the cruelest detail. The orchestra kept playing a bright waltz while Kaelan turned to face her with an expression that held no guilt at all, only mild irritation, as though she were an appointment he'd forgotten to cancel. Elira. He said her name like a formality. I was going to send word. Were you, she said, not a question. Somewhere behind him, Duchess Renata smiled the smile of a woman watching a play she had written herself. Kaelan reached for Elira's hand before she could pull it back, not gently, not for any tender reason, but because he wanted the ring off her finger before the toast, wanted it done publicly so no rumor could later claim he'd been kind about it. The betrothal band, a thin garnet the Duvants had owned for 3 generations, slid off with humiliating ease. Her hands had grown thin this past year, from meals skipped so her father could eat. You were never anything but a debt I inherited, he said, loud enough for the front 3 rows to hear, loud enough that the words would travel through the crowd like fire through dry grass by morning. Sabine's family will bring real strength to this empire. Yours brought nothing but a name no one respects anymore. The laughter came in ripples, careful court laughter, the kind designed to align with power rather than mock it directly, but laughter all the same. Elira felt each ripple like a small stone thrown at her chest. And then she smiled. It confused him. She could see the confusion crack through his composure like a hairline fracture, because humiliated girls were supposed to cry or beg or flee the room in tears that the court could gossip about for weeks. Elira did none of it. She simply looked at him with something that, in hindsight, he would recognize as pity. Keep the ring, she said quietly, loud enough only for him and the Duchess to hear. You'll need something to remember what you gave up. She turned before he could respond, and walked out of the ballroom with her spine straight, and her chin level past 600 whispering nobles, past her own weeping distant cousins, who dared not defend her past the enormous mirrored doors at the entrance, where for exactly 1 heartbeat. Her reflection's eyes burned pure molten gold, and the great mirror cracked from top to bottom with a sound like a gunshot. Half the ballroom turned toward the noise. By the time anyone looked back at the doors, Elira was already gone. And the crack in the mirror remained, a jagged golden scar down the center of the glass that no craftsman in the palace could ever fully repair no matter how many times they replaced the panel, because the crack would return each time exact and unexplainable. Until eventually the palace staff simply covered the mirror with a curtain and told newcomers not to ask. Elira didn't see the crack. She was already 3 hallways away, moving toward the carriage that would take her home for what she knew, with total certainty, would be the last night she ever slept under a Duvant roof. In the carriage alone, she finally let herself breathe, not cry. Breathe long and deep, like someone who had been holding air in their chest for years and had only now been given permission to let it go. You didn't beg, said the voice in her mind, quiet, almost approving. Most who come to me beg first. It wastes so much time. I don't beg for things I intend to take myself, Elira murmured to the empty carriage. Good, Ashkarian said. Then let us discuss what you intend to take. She looked out the window at the palace shrinking behind her, its windows glowing gold against the dark, and understood, with a clarity that felt less like decision and more like prophecy, that she would stand in that ballroom again one day, and next time no one would be laughing. But first, there was a debt to settle with the man who slept in the room down the hall from hers, the father who had signed her away twice, once at 11 and once more silently tonight by doing nothing to stop it. And what she learned about that debt before the sun rose would hurt far more than anything Kaelan Ashvane had said in that ballroom. Elira found her father awake when she returned, which itself was unusual enough to stop her at the study door. Lord Bastian Duvant sat by a dying fire, an unopened letter in his lap, his face gray in a way that had nothing to do with the ash-colored light. He didn't ask about the ball. He didn't need to. A servant had already run ahead with the news, breathless, half-thrilled with the scandal of it, the way servants always are with disasters that aren't their own. "Sit down, Elira," he said, and something in his voice, flat, resigned, stripped of the gentle apology he usually offered her, made her obey without argument. "I assume you've heard," she said. "I assume you already knew before it happened." He looked up at her then. And for the first time in years really looked, not at the daughter he'd arranged and rearranged like furniture in his political calculations, but at a young woman who had apparently seen this coming and prepared for it in a way he hadn't. "You didn't cry in there. The servants say you smiled. Would you have preferred I wept, father, given the court a better show?" He flinched. It was, she realized with quiet surprise, the first time she had ever spoken to him like this, without the careful softness she'd been raised to offer men, especially this man, whose moods had governed the household like weather. "There's something you need to know," he said instead of answering, and unfolded the letter in his lap with hands that trembled slightly. "Something I should have told you years ago when your grandmother died. I told myself I was protecting you. I understand now I was only protecting myself." He explained it slowly, the fire popping and sinking beside them. The Duvant silver mines hadn't simply flooded by accident, as the family had always claimed. They had been sabotaged, deliberately collapsed, by a rival house working in quiet partnership with the Ashvane treasury itself, years before the betrothal contract was ever signed. The engagement to Kaelan hadn't been an honor extended to a proud family. It had been a leash. The crown had crippled House Duvant on purpose, then offered marriage as the only rope thick enough to keep the family from drowning entirely, ensuring the Duvants' remaining assets, connections, and silence would always belong quietly to the Ashvane throne. "They never intended the marriage to last," her father said, voice cracking. "Kaelan was always going to marry money once the throne secured what it needed from us. I've known this for 2 years, Elira. I said nothing because I was afraid of losing the last scraps of protection the betrothal gave us, of what would happen to this house if the crown decided we had outlived our usefulness entirely." Elira sat very still. Somewhere in her mind, a presence stirred with interest. "There it is," Ashkarian murmured, low and patient. "The real wound, not the prince, him. You let them destroy us," Elira said quietly, "and then you let them use me to cover the wound. I was trying to survive." "You were trying to survive," she agreed, standing, her voice terrifyingly calm. "And I was the price you paid for it, twice." Bastian reached for her hand. She stepped back before he could take it, not out of cruelty, but because something in her, old, cold, newly awake, refused to be touched by the hand that had sold her. "Where will you go?" he asked, and for the first time she heard real fear in his voice, not fear for her. She understood with a small, private ache, but fear of being left alone with the consequences of his own choices. "Somewhere they won't think to look," she said. "Somewhere I can become something they never accounted for." She left the study without another word, climbed the stairs to her chambers, and began packing only the essentials. A traveling cloak, a small purse of what coin she had left her grandmother's old journal. The one with pages sealed shut by wax her whole childhood, the one she had never been permitted to open. She opened it that night by candlelight and found her grandmother's handwriting sprawled across the first page in shaking, urgent ink. "If you are reading this, the seal beneath the east wing has chosen you. Do not trust it blindly. Do not fear it either. Ashkarian does not grant power freely, it trades. What it will ask of you I could never discover before it took my mind. Be smarter than I was, child, take its strength, refuse its price." Elira closed the journal slowly. "Your grandmother misunderstood me," Ashkarian said in the dark, almost wounded. "I never asked for her mind, I asked for her fear, she simply couldn't tell the difference." "And what will you ask of me?" Elira said. The candle guttered, though no wind moved through the room. "Only this," the presence said, and for the first time its voice carried something that might have been genuine anticipation. "Become strong enough that no one ever dares throw you away again. That is all I require. The rest, the empire, the throne, the prince who called you a debt, that is simply what tends to happen along the way." By the time dawn broke gray and thin over the Duvant estate, Elira was already 3 miles down the southern road. A hooded traveler among merchants and laborers carrying nothing that marked her as a noblewoman at all, except for a pair of eyes that occasionally in the wrong light flickered gold. She did not look back at the house. She was too busy calculating, with cold and growing precision, exactly how long it would take to become someone the Empire could never again afford to underestimate, and exactly how much time she would need before Kaelan Ashvane discovered precisely what he had thrown away. The road south led to the one place in the Empire where a runaway noblewoman with no name and no coin could disappear entirely. The border town of Kaelthorne, built into the crumbling remains of a war fortress from 3 centuries past, where mercenaries exiled Mage's smugglers. And forgotten people went to become forgotten on purpose. It took Elira 11 days to reach it. Most of them spent hungry. Several spent sleeping in barns beside merchant caravans who assumed, correctly, that she wasn't the kind of traveler who asked many questions or answered many either. She sold her mother's pearl hairpin on the 6th day for enough coin to eat through the 9th. By the 10th, Ashkarian's voice had become less a presence and more a companion, dry, ancient, occasionally cruel in its honesty, but never once lying to her, which was more than she could say for anyone she'd left behind. "You're weak," it told her plainly on the 8th night, as she shivered under a thin blanket outside a wayhouse she couldn't afford to sleep in. "Not in spirit, in body, in training. If I gave you my full strength today, it would burn through you like fire through paper. You would be powerful for exactly 4 seconds and then you would be dead. Then teach me," Elira said through chattering teeth, "how not to be paper. That," Ashkarian said with something almost like approval, "is the correct question." Kaelthorne, when she finally reached it, was nothing like the palace she'd grown up in: gray stone instead of gold leaf, mud instead of marble, the smell of wood smoke and unwashed ambition instead of orange blossom. She found work within a day, scrubbing floors in a tavern called the Broken Compass, run by a retired mercenary named Soren Voss who asked no questions about her past because, as he told her flatly on her first night, everyone here left something behind. "Yours isn't my business unless it walks in through my door looking for you." It was in the cellar of that tavern, after the last drunk had stumbled home and the fire had burned to embers, that Elira began her real training, not with sword or spellbook but with pain. Ashkarian did not teach the way court tutors taught. There were no gentle corrections, no patient repetition. It taught by making her asterisk feel the shape of magic in her own bones, forcing raw, ungoverned power through her body in small, controlled bursts that left her gasping on the cellar floor, night after night, for weeks that blurred into months. "You're trying to kill me," she gasped one night in early winter, blood at the corner of her mouth from where she'd bitten through her own lip. "I am trying to teach you what almost dying feels like," Ashkarian corrected, "so that when it happens on a battlefield instead of a cellar, you recognize the sensation and don't panic. Panic kills faster than any wound." Now again. She learned to bend flame without letting it consume her sleeve. She learned to read the weight of a spell in the air before it was cast, the way a sailor reads weather in the color of a cloud. She learned slowly that magic, true magic, the kind sealed beneath her family's estate for 4 centuries, was not about power at all, but about precision, about knowing exactly how much force a moment required and never, ever spending more than that. It was in Kaelthorne, 6 months into her training, that she met the 2 people who would become the only family she trusted for the next 4 years. The first was Ren, a scarred former Imperial soldier turned bounty hunter, who caught her practicing alone in the ruins outside town one night and instead of reporting the strange lights to the local watch, simply sat down on a broken pillar and watched with open curiosity until she'd finished. "You're not from around here," he said afterward, not a question. "Court hands, court posture. Somebody trained you to walk into a room like you owned it, and then somebody made sure you never got the chance." "Something like that," Elira said. "I don't care what you ran from," Ren said, standing, brushing dust from his coat. "I care whether you're planning on getting good enough to matter. Because if you are, you're going to need someone who knows how the Empire actually works outside the pretty parts. I know every smuggling route, every corrupt magistrate, and every noble house's dirty secret between here and the capital. Interested?" The second was Ophelia Marsh, a disgraced court alchemist who'd been exiled from the Royal Academy for unauthorized research that, as she explained with a wicked grin over their first shared bottle of cheap wine, had actually just been researched. The Academy's male faculty were too jealous to let a woman publish first. Ophelia taught Elira the science beneath the magic, how to brew potions that could counteract poison, how to identify the mineral compounds that made certain spell circles stronger, how to think about power not as mystery but as asterisk system asterisk, something that could be studied, optimized, mastered. By the end of that first year in Kaelthorne, Elira Duvant, The girl who had once been humiliated in a ballroom for having nothing left to offer had quietly become something the Empire had no records of at all. A mage of terrifying disciplined, rapidly growing power. Hidden behind the face of a tavern made nobody important would ever think to look at twice. She sent no letters home. She heard secondhand through Ren's contacts that her father's health had worsened, that House Duvant's remaining assets were being slowly absorbed into Ashvane Holdings. That Kaelan's engagement to Sabine Cormont had been finalized with a wedding date set for 4 years hence, timed deliberately to coincide with the completion of the southern trade route that would make House Cormont one of the wealthiest in the Empire. 4 years. It gave her a deadline. It gave her more than anything else a target. You could move faster, Ashkarian noted one night, watching her collapse, exhausted but standing, after successfully holding a containment circle for the first time without its help. Reckless, hungry, it would shorten your timeline considerably. I'm not interested in being fast, Elira said, wiping blood from her nose, breathing hard. I'm interested in being finished by the time it matters. There's a difference. Yes, Ashkarian agreed, and for the first time, something that might have been genuine respect colored its ancient voice. There is. Most who come to power forget that distinction. It is, generally, the reason they fail. Outside the cellar window, the first snow of winter began to fall over Kaelthorne and somewhere in the capital 400 miles north. Prince Kaelan Ashvane raised a toast to his new fiancée, without once wondering what had become of the girl he'd humiliated in front of 600 witnesses. Without once suspecting that the debt he thought he'd erased was in fact quietly accruing interest with every day that passed. The letter arrived in the depths of Elira's second winter in Kaelthorne, delivered by a courier who nearly didn't recognize her beneath the layers of a working woman's plain wool coat. Her father was dying. Not the slow decline she'd heard about through Ren's network, a sudden collapse. A fever the court physicians couldn't name a decline so swift. The family steward had sent the letter more out of formality than hope, assuming correctly that Elira had no intention of returning to a house that had sold her twice. She read the letter twice by candlelight, Ashkarian silent in the back of her mind in a way that felt unusually like it was giving her space to decide for herself. I'm going back, she said finally. Why? Ashkarian asked, and for once the question held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. He sold you twice by his own admission. You owe him nothing. I know, Elira said, folding the letter carefully. I'm not going back for him. I'm going back to see what's left of the house before the crown finishes taking it, and to remind myself one more time exactly what I'm building toward. Ren insisted on accompanying her, despite her protests that a bounty hunter's scarred face and battle-worn coat would draw exactly the kind of attention she didn't want near House Duvant's remaining lands. Ophelia stayed behind, muttering about a potion formula she was close to perfecting, but pressed a small vial into Elira's palm before she left. For emergencies, she said. Don't ask what's in it. Just trust that it'll buy you 30 seconds when 30 seconds is all you have. The road north felt different this time. 2 years ago she had walked it as a broken girl running from a life that had discarded her. Now she rode it. Ren had insisted on horses and insisted further on paying for them himself. A kindness she still didn't fully know how to accept, as someone who no longer flinched at the memory of that ballroom, who could recall Kaelan's voice reciting the words, "Nothing but a debt I inherited," without feeling anything sharper than distant clinical interest. The way one might recall an old bruise that had long since stopped hurting. They reached the Duvant estate on a gray afternoon 3 days before the winter solstice, and Elira understood immediately from the state of the gates alone that she had returned too late for anything but the ending. Half the estate's remaining staff had already left, unpaid for months. The gardens her mother had once tended obsessively were choked with frost-killed weeds. And in the master bedroom, propped against pillows gone yellow with age, Lord Bastian Duvant lay pale and thin, his breath rattling, his eyes finding his daughter's face with something between disbelief and desperate relief. You came, he whispered. I came to see the house, Elira said, sitting carefully at his bedside, her voice gentler than she'd expected it to be before it's gone entirely. He tried to laugh, it turned into a cough that shook his whole frail body. Still angry with me. Still, she agreed, but anger and presence aren't opposites, father, I can hold both. They spoke for an hour, not reconciliation, not quite, but something adjacent to it, an honest accounting between two people who had run out of time to pretend otherwise, he told her. In fragments between labored breaths, everything he hadn't said before. The names of the officials who'd taken bribes to falsify the mine collapse, reports the location of a strongbox hidden beneath the chapel floor containing the original unaltered deeds to 3 properties the crown believed it had already seized. And most valuable of all, a list written in his own trembling hand of every noble house that owed House Duvant favors old enough that most had forgotten the debts existed at all. "I couldn't save the house," he said, his voice fading. "But I can at least make sure you have the tools to build something new from its ashes. That's the only apology I have left to give you, Elira. I'm sorry it's 5 years too late." He died 2 hours before midnight quietly, his hand still loosely holding hers. Elira did not cry that night either, not from coldness, but because she had done her grieving for her father years ago the night he'd confessed his betrayal by the dying fire, and what remained now was simply the quiet, practical work of closing one chapter before beginning the next. She buried him at dawn, in the small family plot beside her grandmother, with only Ren, 2 remaining servants, and a single hired priest in attendance. A funeral so modest it would have horrified the court that had once fawned over House Duvant's silver mines. She retrieved the strongbox from beneath the chapel floor that same morning, its contents exactly as her father had described, and stood for a long moment in the ruined east wing, staring at the sealed cellar door that had changed the entire direction of her life 2 winters ago. "Going to say goodbye to me properly this time?" Ashkarian asked, faintly amused. "I'm saying goodbye to the girl who used to live here," Elira said. "She's not coming back. Whatever walks out of these gates today is someone else entirely." As she and Ren rode away from the Duvant estate for what she believed would be the final time, snow beginning to fall in fat, silent flakes across the frozen fields, neither of them noticed the rider watching from the tree line half a mile distant, a Cormont scout. Sent quietly by Duchess Renata months earlier to monitor House Duvant's remaining assets for any sign of activity, who had just witnessed a mysterious hooded woman leave the estate carrying a strongbox the crown had believed didn't exist. The scout's report, sent north by Raven that same evening, would not reach Duchess Renata's desk for another 11 days. By the time it did, Elira Duvant would already be someone entirely new, and the report describing a hooded woman of interest near the ruins of House Duvant would be misfiled, and eventually forgotten beneath 100 more urgent matters of court. Exactly the kind of clerical oversight that empires built on arrogance always eventually come to regret. Back in Kaelthorn, the strongbox's contents changed everything. The unaltered deeds meant Elira legally still owned 3 properties the crown believed it had fully absorbed, including. Buried in dry legal language, her father had underlined twice a controlling interest in a shipping company operating out of the southern strait that the Cormont family's new trade route depended on entirely to reach imperial ports. "You understand what this means," Ophelia said, spreading the documents across the tavern's back table, her alchemist's eyes gleaming with the particular delight of someone who loved a well-built trap. "Sabine Cormont's entire dowry, the thing that made her more valuable to the crown than you ever were, runs through a company you legally still control a third of. It means," Ren added, grinning, "that in about 4 years, right around the time of a certain royal wedding, somebody's going to discover their bride's family fortune has a very expensive, very legal hole in it." Elira allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, something that felt almost like satisfaction, but Ashkarian's voice cut through the moment with characteristic bluntness. "Documents are useful, they are not power. A piece of paper cannot stand in a room and defend itself when powerful people decide the law is inconvenient. If you intend to use this leverage, you must first become someone the Empire cannot simply erase. Because right now, if Duchess Renata learns what you hold, her solution will not be negotiation. It will be a knife in the dark and a body no one finds until spring thaw. Then let's make sure I'm not that easy to erase," Elira said. What followed was the hardest year of her training, the year Ashkarian stopped teaching her control and started teaching her war. She traveled with Ren to the Empire's disputed southern border, where minor territorial skirmishes with the neighboring Kestrian kingdom provided exactly the kind of real, high-stakes combat that no cellar training could replicate. She fought carefully anonymously under a hood and a borrowed name, the Grey Ash. A moniker that began within months to circulate through mercenary circles with a mixture of curiosity and unease, because no one could explain how a single hooded fighter had single-handedly turned back a raiding party of 11 Kestrian soldiers, without a scratch leaving them alive but utterly disarmed. Their weapons melted into slag at their feet. She learned, in those border skirmishes, the difference between power used in anger and power used with intention, a distinction Ashkarian drilled into her relentlessly. "Anyone can burn a village," it told her after one battle, watching her deliberately spare a young Kestrian conscript who dropped his sword and begged. "It takes discipline to burn only what deserves burning. Mercy used correctly is not weakness, it is a message." That boy will tell every soldier in his camp what he saw today, a fighter powerful enough to kill him instantly, who chose not to. That story will spread faster and further than any massacre would have, and it will spread in your favor. By the end of that third year, the Grey Ash had become a name spoken in hushed, uncertain tones across 3 kingdoms worth of mercenary taverns. Never confirmed as a woman, never confirmed as anything but a rumor with an alarming body count of disarmed rather than dead opponents. Which somehow made the legend more unsettling, not less. It was during this year that Elira also began, quietly and methodically, to call in her father's old debts, the favors listed in his final letter, owed by noble houses who had long assumed the obligations died with House Duvant's fortune. She did not reveal her identity to most of them. She worked through intermediaries, through Wren's contacts, through carefully worded letters signed only with a small gray ash sigil that meant nothing to anyone yet, but would in time come to mean everything, piece by piece. She rebuilt what her father had lost, not the silver mines which were beyond saving, but something more valuable, a quiet network of allies who owed her discretion, information, and favors. None of whom knew they were being assembled into the foundation of a woman's return to a ballroom she'd once walked out of in gray. And through it all Ashkarian's power grew inside her, not given freely, never given freely, but earned in cellars and battlefields and long sleepless nights of study, until the raw, dangerous force that had once burned through her, like fire through paper, as it had warned her that first winter, now moved through her veins like something that belonged there. Something that had always belonged there, waiting only for her to grow strong enough to hold it. "You are close now," Ashkarian told her on the eve of her 4th year in exile, its ancient voice carrying something that, for the first time, sounded almost like pride. "Close enough that I should tell you the truth I have withheld since the beginning, the price you asked about that first night in the cellar." Elira went very still. "I wondered when you'd finally answer that." "The price was never your soul or your mind, as your grandmother feared," Ashkarian said. "The price is simpler and far more dangerous. When your power reaches its true height, you will face a choice the Empire will force upon you, a choice between the throne you could claim for yourself and the justice you originally sought. Most who reach this point choose the throne. Power, once tasted fully, tends to prefer more of itself over old grievances. And if I choose justice instead, then you will be the first in 400 years to prove that vengeance and restraint can occupy the same hand," Ashkarian said. "I confess, Elira Duvant, I am curious to see which you choose. It has been a very long time since anything about a host has genuinely surprised me." Elira looked north, toward the distant, invisible line where the capital's spires would be visible if the world were smaller, and felt the truth of that choice settling into her bones like the first frost of a winter she knew. Now she would not be spending in exile. The wedding of Prince Kaelan Ashvane and Sabine Cormont was 11 months away. She intended to arrive exactly 1 month before it, with a face the court might recognize, a power the Empire had never accounted for, and a debt collection that had been quietly accruing interest for nearly 5 years. The rumors reached the capital 3 weeks before Elira did. Whispers of a mysterious noblewoman, some said a foreign duchess, others a war hero from the southern border conflicts, who had begun buying up quiet, controlling shares in half a dozen struggling trade companies across the Empire, always through intermediaries, always paying generously, always asking. As part of every transaction, one strange and specific question: did the company have any dealings, however small, with House Cormont's southern shipping routes? Duchess Renata heard the rumors and dismissed them as the usual noise of provincial gossip. She had a wedding to finalize, a trade agreement to secure, and a prince who had grown increasingly restless and short-tempered as the pressures of the crown settled onto his shoulders in ways his mother had never fully prepared him for. She did not connect the rumors to a single forgotten scout report about a hooded woman near the ruins of House Duvant, 4 years old and buried beneath a mountain of more urgent correspondence. She had no reason to. As far as the crown's official records were concerned, Elira Duvant had vanished into obscurity or death sometime during her 2nd year of exile, a minor, forgettable footnote in the long history of noble houses that simply faded once their usefulness expired. Elira arrived at the capital on a cool spring morning 3 weeks before Kaelan's wedding in a carriage that bore no house crest, accompanied by Wren, now dressed in the fine understated clothes of a personal guard rather than a border mercenary, and by Ophelia, who had spent the last year perfecting a series of alchemical compounds that Elira suspected she'd never fully explain the full danger of. She did not go to the palace first. She went to the one place in the capital that still, technically, belonged to her, a small townhouse on the city's western edge, one of the three properties the strongbox deeds had protected from crown seizure, its address obscure enough that no one currently in power remembered it existed. From there, over the following 2 weeks, Elira Duvant, under a new name Lady Ashvane Grey, a title she'd purchased quietly through a minor foreign barony 3 years prior specifically for this purpose, began systematically, patiently, and devastatingly assembling the final pieces of a plan that had taken 5 years to build. She met one by one with the noble houses whose debts her father had listed, houses who had no idea Lady Ashvane Grey and the daughter of their old debt holder were the same woman houses who found themselves surprisingly persuaded by this striking. Composed strangers' soft-spoken but ironclad arguments about the wisdom of diversifying their political loyalties before the Cormont wedding cemented a trade monopoly that would squeeze smaller houses out of the southern shipping lanes entirely. She met with the shipping company's board, revealing at last through carefully verified legal documentation her legitimate controlling interest, a reveal that sent a very specific, very private tremor of panic through exactly the parts of the Cormont financial empire that could least afford 3 weeks before a wedding meant to celebrate that same empire's unshakable strength. And on the 9th night, in the private study of her rented townhouse, she finally faced the mirror properly for the first time in 5 years. Not the cracked hallway mirror of the Ashvane Palace, but a plain, honest looking glass she'd bought from a local craftsman, and really looked at the woman staring back. 5 years had changed her in ways that had nothing to do with magic. Her posture was different, not the careful, folded posture of a girl trained to take up as little space as possible, but the deliberate, grounded stillness of someone who had learned, the hard way, exactly how much space she was entitled to occupy. Her eyes, when the light caught them just right, still carried that faint flicker of gold, though she had long since learned to control when it showed and when it didn't. There were small scars now too, one along her collarbone from a Kestrian blade that had gotten closer than it should have, one across her left palm from an early, disastrous attempt at containing raw elemental fire before she'd learned the proper technique. She did not look like the girl who had walked out of that ballroom in gray 5 years ago. She looked like someone the Empire had made entirely by accident in the process of trying to throw her away. "Second thoughts?" Ashkarian asked, sensing something contemplative in her stillness. "No," Elira said, "just recognition. I don't think I would have known myself 5 years ago if I'd passed this woman on the street." "That," Ashkarian said, "is generally how it works. The people who tell you that becoming powerful will make you unrecognizable to yourself are not wrong. They are simply wrong to treat it as a warning rather than a promise." 2 days later, an invitation arrived at Lady Ashvane Grey's townhouse, one Elira had spent considerable effort through her network of newly indebted allies ensuring would arrive. A formal summons to the pre-wedding gala at Ashvane Palace, where the Empire's wealthiest and most powerful houses would gather to celebrate the union of Prince Kaelan and Sabine Cormont one final time before the ceremony itself. Elira held the cream-colored card in her hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of 5 years of cellar training, battlefield discipline, and patient, methodical revenge condensing into a single, simple piece of paper. "Are you ready?" Ashkarian asked, and for once the ancient presence sounded almost gentle. "I've been ready for 5 years," Elira said, setting the invitation carefully on her desk beside her father's final letter, her grandmother's sealed journal, and the strongbox deeds that had made all of this possible. "I was just waiting for the right room to walk back into." Outside her window, the capital's spires caught the last light of evening gold and distant, and somewhere within them, in a palace ballroom being prepared for a wedding celebration. Prince Kaelan Ashvane had no idea that the debt he dismissed 5 years ago as beneath his notice was about to walk back through his front door, dressed not in humble gray this time, but in something considerably more dangerous. The night of the gala, Ashvane Palace glittered exactly as it had 5 years before, the same orange blossom, the same gold chandeliers, the same 600 nobles rehearsing their careful court laughter for whatever entertainment the evening might provide. Elira arrived fashionably, deliberately late, in a gown the deep, molten black gold of a dying ember, cut with the kind of understated severity that drew more attention than any ostentatious display could have managed. Ren stood at her shoulder in formal guard's dress, sharp-eyed and silent. Ophelia, disguised as a visiting alchemist from the northern academies, a role close enough to her actual former profession that she barely had to lie, worked the edges of the crowd, quietly confirming that certain guests she'd need later in the evening were, in fact, present. Lady Ashvane Grey, the herald announced at the ballroom doors, and Elira watched with the same private patient satisfaction she'd felt watching those business deals unravel over the past 3 weeks. as 600 heads turned to examine an unfamiliar name attached to a face that struck an uncomfortable, unplaceable chord of recognition in at least a dozen of the older nobles present. Duchess Renata was the first to approach, drawn, as always, by the scent of new wealth and unclaimed political territory. Lady Grey, I don't believe we've had the pleasure. You'll forgive an old woman's curiosity, but your face is remarkably familiar. I'm told I have one of those faces, Your Grace, Elira said, offering a smile of perfect, practiced courtesy. The same smile, in fact, that Duchess Renata had once dismissed as the pathetic performance of a discarded girl, though the Duchess showed no sign of recognizing it now. Though I understand congratulations are in order, your son's wedding is the talk of 3 kingdoms. Yes, well, Duchess Renata's smile sharpened with the particular pride of a woman who believed she had orchestrated an unassailable political triumph. Sabine's family has secured trade routes that will make this empire the wealthiest in 3 generations. It's a union built on far more solid ground than his previous arrangement. How fortunate, Elira said, that solid ground so rarely shifts without warning. Something flickered across the Duchess's face, not recognition, not yet, but the faint, instinctive unease of a predator sensing an unfamiliar scent in territory she'd thought fully mapped. Before she could pursue it further, the orchestra shifted into the evening's ceremonial toast, and the crowd's attention turned, inevitably, toward the raised dais where Prince Kaelan stood beside Sabine Cormont, glass raised. The picture of a man who believed his life's most difficult chapter was long behind him. Elira watched him from across the ballroom, and felt, with a kind of clinical, almost scientific curiosity, for any lingering trace of the pain that had once defined this exact scene from the opposite angle. She found remarkably little. What remained was not heartbreak, but something closer to recognition. The plain, unremarkable sight of a man who had never once, in 5 years, wondered what became of the person he'd discarded, because he had never considered her important enough to wonder about. That, she realized, watching him laugh at some joke from a nearby lord, was its own kind of answer. The toast concluded. The dancing began, and it was during the second dance of the evening, as Kaelan, making his rounds among the assembled nobles, found himself. Through the careful and entirely deliberate social choreography, Elira and Ophelia had spent 2 weeks arranging, standing directly in front of Lady Ashen Grey. That recognition finally catastrophically arrived. He looked at her the way a man looks at a word on the tip of his tongue, and then his face went the particular shade of white that comes not from fear, but from the sudden, sickening arithmetic of realizing exactly how badly he has miscalculated. Elira, he said, barely above a whisper, the ballroom's music and laughter swirling obliviously around them. Lady Ashen Grey, currently, she corrected pleasantly, though I understand the confusion. It has, after all, been 5 years. He glanced around, suddenly, desperately aware of how many powerful ears surrounded them. What are you doing here? Attending your wedding celebration, Elira said, as any invited guest might, though I confess, Your Highness, I did have one small piece of business to attend to first. She glanced deliberately toward the ballroom's grand entrance, where, at that exact moment on cue, a small delegation of merchants and shipping officials entered, led by a nervous-looking board representative from the very shipping company whose controlling interest Elira had spent 3 weeks quietly, legally reclaiming. Lord Cormont, the representative announced, loud enough to carry across the sudden hush that fell as the music inexplicably faltered, requests an urgent audience. There has been a significant complication discovered in the Southern Trade Routes ownership documentation. Every head in the ballroom turned. Sabine Cormont's confident smile flickered just once, into something considerably more uncertain. And Duchess Renata, watching the color drain from her son's face as he stared at a woman she had, moments ago, complimented on her familiar features, finally, 5 years and 11 days too late, understood exactly who Lady Ashen Grey truly was. The Duchess breathed, the word landing in the sudden silence like a struck bell. Elira turned to face her, unhurried, the faint golden flicker in her eyes catching the chandelier light in a way that, for the first time that evening, made half the room step back without quite understanding why. Yes, Elira said, her voice carrying, deliberate and clear, through a ballroom that had gone utterly, breathlessly silent. What followed was not a battle. Elira had learned in 5 years of careful, patient design that the most devastating revenge rarely required raising a hand at all. 5 years ago, she said, her voice steady, pitched to carry to every corner of the ballroom without ever rising to a shout. In this exact room, Prince Kaelan Ashvane informed 600 witnesses that I was nothing but a debt he had inherited. He was, in fact, entirely correct, though not in the way he intended. She let the silence stretch, watching Kaelan's face cycle rapidly through disbelief, panic, and the dawning, horrified realization that whatever was about to happen was already far beyond his ability to stop. House Duvant's silver mines, Elira continued, did not flood by accident. They were deliberately sabotaged by agents working in coordination with the Crown Treasury in order to cripple my family and force a betrothal that would keep our remaining assets, connections, and silence conveniently under Ashvane control. My father discovered this 2 years before his death. He told me everything the night before I left this palace for what everyone here assumed was the last time. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the particular electric murmur of nobles realizing they were witnessing precisely the kind of scandal that would define court conversation for the next decade. When I left, Elira said, I inherited exactly one thing of value: the knowledge that this empire had already taken everything it believed I had to offer and had not thought to check whether I might build something new from what remained. It appears, she continued, glancing pointedly toward the shipping delegation still waiting at the ballroom's entrance, that oversight has become rather expensive. The shipping representative visibly sweating under the weight of 600 aristocratic stares confirmed in halting. Formal language exactly what Elira had spent 3 weeks arranging for this precise moment. That Lady Ashen Grey, formerly Lady Elira Duvant, held legally verified unimpeachable controlling interest in the shipping infrastructure underpinning House Cormont's entire southern trade route. The same route whose projected revenues had formed the financial backbone of Sabine Cormont's dowry and by extension the entire political calculation behind Kaelan's second engagement. You understand what this means, Elira said quietly to Kaelan, who had gone very still beside his visibly horrified bride-to-be. Every projection your mother built this marriage upon, every trade agreement, every promised revenue stream, every reason Sabine's dowry outweighed mine 5 years ago, currently requires my signature to proceed. I could, of course, simply refuse to sign anything at all. Watch the entire arrangement collapse under its own weight the way House Duvant once did. Elira, Kaelan started, his voice cracking with something that might have been desperation. But I won't, she said, and watched genuine confusion war with relief across his face. Not because I've forgiven you. I haven't, not because I no longer remember exactly how it felt to have a ring torn off my finger in front of 600 laughing witnesses. I remember every detail. I intend to remember it for the rest of my life, the way you should remember every choice that brought you to this exact, humiliating moment. She stepped closer, close enough now that only Kaelan, Sabine, and Duchess Renata could hear her final words clearly. I won't collapse your trade route, she said, because I don't need to destroy you to prove I've already won. I'll release my interest in the shipping company for a price. Full, public restoration of House Duvant's original mining rights, formal crown acknowledgement of the sabotage that crippled my family, and financial compensation equal to every year of revenue this empire stole from us. You'll sign it tonight, in front of every witness currently in this ballroom, because refusing will cost you considerably more than agreeing ever could. Duchess Renata's composure finally cracked entirely. You cannot possibly believe the crown will simply. The crown, Elira interrupted, and for the first time that evening, something genuinely dangerous entered her voice, quiet and absolute. Spent 5 years assuming a discarded girl with nothing left to lose would simply disappear. I would think very carefully, Your Grace, before making a second assumption about what I am and am not capable of enforcing. As if in answer, the chandeliers above the ballroom flickered once sharply and for exactly one heartbeat. Every mirror and polished surface in the grand hall reflected Elira's eyes, as pure molten gold, a silent, wordless demonstration that required no further explanation to anyone who had spent the last 5 years underestimating House Duvant's last remaining daughter. The silence that followed lasted 11 full seconds. Ren, standing quietly near the ballroom's edge, counted every one of them before Prince Kaelan Ashvane, pale, humbled, and entirely out of options, asked for a pen. The formal restoration papers were signed within the hour, witnessed by more nobles than any legal document in the Empire's recent history, ensuring, exactly as Elira had intended, that no future crown administration could quietly reverse the agreement without provoking a scandal too large to survive. House Duvant's mining rights were restored in full within the month. The compensation, substantial enough to rebuild the estate twice over, arrived from the Crown Treasury with the particular grudging speed of an institution eager to make an embarrassment disappear as quickly as possible. Kaelan's wedding proceeded, 6 weeks later than planned, in a ceremony noticeably smaller and quieter than originally intended, the kind of wedding a family holds when it has learned, publicly and permanently, that its confidence had once dramatically outpaced its judgment. Elira did not attend. She spent that day instead at the rebuilt Duvant estate, standing in the east garden beside the same cracked stone fountain where Mabel had once warned her, 5 years ago, of a humiliation she'd already known was coming. The fountain had been repaired along with everything else, its water running clear and steady for the first time in over a decade. "You could have taken more," Ren said, joining her, watching the water catch the afternoon light. "The throne, even. Half this empire seems to think you could have claimed it outright after that display." "I know," Elira said. "Any regrets?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things now, carefully, without haste, weighing costs against what actually mattered rather than what merely glittered. "He asked you this once before," Ashkarian observed quietly from somewhere deep in her thoughts. "Do you remember what you told me that first night in the cellar?" "I told you I had nothing left to lose," Elira murmured, more to herself than to Ren, "because everything worth keeping had already been taken from me. And now," she looked around the restored garden at the fountain, the repaired stonework. Mabel tending flowerbeds nearby with the same devoted care. She'd shown a broken family for 30 years. Ophelia's laboratory, now occupying the old east wing, where the cellar seal had first stirred to life. Ren standing loyal at her shoulder the way he had for 5 years, and she suspected would for many more to come. "Now," Elira said, "I have quite a lot worth keeping, which means I suppose that I finally have something to lose again. Does that frighten you?" She smiled, not the small, private smile she'd offered the ballroom 5 years ago while a ring was pulled from her finger, but something warmer, something earned. "No," she said, "it means I finally have a reason to keep getting stronger, not to punish anyone. Just to protect what's mine." "A wiser answer," Ashkarian said, "than most who reach this point ever manage. I believe I chose correctly that night in the cellar." "You didn't choose me," Elira reminded it, amused. "I chose you. I was the one who climbed down those stairs." "Yes," Ashkarian agreed, something that might almost have been fondness threading through its ancient voice. "That, I suspect, is precisely why it worked." The Empire would spend years afterward telling the story of Lady Elira Duvant in dozens of different versions, some painting her as a vengeful sorceress who'd nearly toppled a royal wedding out of spite. Others as a wronged noblewoman who'd shown remarkable restraint when total destruction had been well within her grasp. Still others as simply the Grey Ash, a legend from the southern border conflicts whose true identity the court had only belatedly discovered. Few of the storytellers ever agreed on which version was closest to true, and Elira, for her part, never bothered correcting any of them. She understood, better than anyone in 6 Kingdoms, that the stories people told about a woman rarely mattered half as much as the life that woman quietly, deliberately built for herself, once she'd finally stopped waiting for anyone else's permission to become powerful. House Duvant stood restored, its gardens blooming again by summer's end, its name spoken once more with respect rather than pity across the noble houses of the empire. And in the quiet hours after each long day of rebuilding, Elira would sometimes return to that same cracked fountain in the east garden, watching the water run clear, remembering without bitterness now, the girl who had once knelt in a cellar with nothing left to lose. That girl had believed that night that she was making a desperate bargain out of grief. She understood now, 5 years and one restored empire later, that she had actually been making a promise to herself, to the family she'd once failed to protect. And to every version of herself the world had underestimated along the way, that being thrown away was never ever going to be the end of her story. It had only ever been the beginning.